The courtroom smelled of polished wood and stale anger. The air itself seemed to judge, heavy, perfumed faintly with bleach and the nervous sweat of people pretending they had control. Light came in sideways through the blinds, sharp as scalpels, slicing faces into bands of gold and shadow. Everything about the room felt deliberate, the worn Bible on the clerk's desk, the distant hum of the air conditioner struggling against late summer heat, even the ceiling fan that turned too slowly, as if afraid to draw attention. Althea sat at the defense table, hands folded neatly, eyes fixed on the dark grain of the wood beneath her. She'd spent the past 3 hours being talked about rather than spoken to. Reckless endangerment, they called it, though all she had done was raise her voice at the wrong man in a uniform. The prosecutor's words dripped with professional concern, the judge's with bureaucratic fatigue. Somewhere behind her, someone coughed. Somewhere else, someone laughed under their breath. Every sound landed on her skin like dust. When the officer stepped closer, the air changed. It was the kind of silence that made you feel like you'd missed a cue. He asked her to stand. She did. His face was calm, polite, the way people are when they know the world is on their side. He said something she didn't catch, maybe, "Don't talk back," or, "You people never learn." She opened her mouth, not to protest, just to breathe. And then came the slap. It wasn't loud. It wasn't cinematic. It was a small sound, human-sized, followed by the soft gasp of a dozen people deciding to pretend they hadn't seen it. The bailiff looked away. The judge looked down. The ceiling fan continued its lazy rotation, slicing the light into equal pieces. For a moment, Althea thought time itself had blushed. The edges of the world pulsed faintly, colors bleeding into each other. Her cheek burned, but her mind was cold, frighteningly clear. She watched the dust motes hanging in the air, suspended mid-drift, as if gravity had forgotten its job. The sound of her heartbeat stretched into an echo that didn't end. When the gavel finally struck, the sound arrived late. Too late. It reverberated endlessly, like a looped recording. Somewhere in that echo, something gave way. Althea blinked, and the room seemed to reset. The officer's hand was still in the air, frozen inches from her face. The judge's mouth was open, mid-word. Time had stopped, or perhaps it had simply paused to catch its breath. She felt her pulse racing in her throat, each beat a small explosion. She could hear it, not inside her, but around her, like the building itself was mimicking her heart. She took one step backward. The floor creaked, obediently, as though it had always waited for her to move. She glanced at the clock above the judge's head, 2:37. The second hand twitched once, then gave up. Althea tried to speak, and her voice came out too loud in the stillness. "Hello." The sound didn't travel. It sat there, thick and visible, curling like smoke. She laughed quietly, a nervous, incredulous sound, and for the first time all day, no one told her to be quiet. At the far end of the courtroom, the door handle shimmered faintly. She walked toward it, her shoes clicking too slowly, each step stretching into seconds. When she touched the handle, the metal was warm. Not the warmth of touch, but of memory, as if the door had been waiting centuries for this moment. Outside, the hallway was empty. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead, buzzing like trapped insects. A piece of paper fluttered midair, caught in the invisible syrup of suspended time. She plucked it gently, it was her own citation. The letters rearranged themselves before her eyes, spelling something that wasn't English. Symbols, maybe. Equations. Or perhaps names. Althea folded it carefully and put it in her pocket. "Fine," she said to no one. "Let's see how far this goes." The first step she took forward sent a ripple down the corridor. The walls sighed. The clock above the security door ticked once, reluctantly. And then she felt it, the drag of seconds, heavy as wet fabric, pulling her backward and forward at once. She was moving through something thicker than time, a membrane that didn't want to be crossed. Voices began whispering behind the walls, faint but familiar. Her grandmother's voice, telling stories of how the world once bent differently for those who knew how to listen. The laughter of children. The low murmur of news anchors announcing verdicts that never changed. They overlapped, layered like radio frequencies bleeding into each other. Althea pressed her palm to the wall. The surface vibrated gently, responding to her touch like living skin. "You're not real," she whispered, though part of her wasn't sure who she was talking to. The lights flickered. For a brief second, everything around her shimmered, a courtroom again, then a hallway, then a subway tunnel full of unmoving faces. The worlds folded over each other like pages in a book she hadn't realized she'd been writing. She stumbled, catching her breath. "Okay," she muttered, half amused, half terrified. "Either I've lost my mind, or I've finally found it." Somewhere, impossibly far away, she heard the gavel fall again. The sound reached her late, bending through whatever space she occupied now. But beneath that echo was another, a quieter rhythm. A ticking, patient and deliberate. It wasn't the clock this time. It was her. Althea closed her eyes. For the first time, she didn't flinch at the sound. She listened, counted the beats, and smiled faintly. The moment stretched, then stretched further, until it felt endless. And then, in the pause between heartbeats, the world began to move again, but not in the same order. The morning came without light. It arrived instead as a thinning of shadow, a reluctant breath that made the world visible but not warm. Althea woke on a bench outside the courthouse, though she did not remember leaving the building. Her cheek still tingled faintly, as if memory itself were tender to the touch. The street was silent, but not empty. Cars stood mid-motion, pigeons hung suspended in the air, and a man across the road was caught in the act of dropping his coffee. Everything shimmered faintly, frozen in a moment that refused to finish. Althea sat up slowly, the movement releasing faint ripples through the air. It felt like disturbing the surface of a deep, dark pond. Her first thought was absurdly practical: I could steal that coffee before it falls. The humor startled her, dry and inappropriate, but necessary. It made her feel human again. She didn't, of course. Instead she watched the cup hang there, drops of liquid caught in mid-splash, forming an amber constellation against the pale morning light. "Okay," she whispered. "What now?" Her voice seemed to wake the air. The nearest streetlight flickered once. A sound, like a breath drawn sharply through metal, rose from behind her. She turned. The courthouse doors stood ajar, though she was certain she'd closed them. Inside was darkness, the kind that wasn't simply absence of light but presence of something else, something thick, attentive. Althea hesitated, then stepped inside. The echo of her footsteps came a fraction too late. The hallway was different now. The fluorescent bulbs hummed softly, their glow shifting from white to a faint, bruised violet. On the walls, portraits of past judges stared down with blurred faces. One seemed to turn its head as she passed, but when she looked again, it was still. In the courtroom itself, the air felt alive. Papers fluttered, benches groaned, and the clock above the judge's bench ticked, slowly, deliberately, though the second hand never moved. She walked to the defense table and touched the surface. It was warm again, humming with that same hidden vibration. "You," she said to it quietly. "You're not just furniture, are you?" The table, naturally, said nothing. But a faint whisper seemed to bloom from within the wood. Words without language. She felt them rather than heard them, questions, or maybe accusations. The sensation made her dizzy, as if something behind the surface of time was trying to speak through her skin. Then, like a flicker between frames, the courtroom changed. The benches filled. The judge reappeared, mid-motion, the officer's hand still raised. Althea gasped and stepped back, but the scene didn't continue. It hung there, repeating itself in silence, over and over. The slap that hadn't yet happened echoed as a ghostly memory. She reached toward the officer, her fingers brushing the edge of his sleeve. The fabric shimmered, then dissolved into light. Beneath it was not flesh but something like glass, smooth and hollow. She stumbled backward. "You're not real," she said again, this time to all of them. A voice answered, not from any direction, but from within her own head. "Neither are you, in this moment." She froze. "Who's there?" The silence that followed was absolute. Then, softly, "You asked what now?" "This is now." Althea turned in a slow circle. "I don't understand." "Understanding isn't required. Balance is." Her heart raced. The courtroom walls pulsed faintly, breathing in and out. "Balance of what?" The whisper came again, almost kind. "Of stories. Of beginnings and endings. You broke one. Now you must fix another." She laughed, though it sounded wrong in her throat. "I didn't break anything. I just stopped him." "You stopped everything." The word struck her with quiet certainty. She realized then that the frozen world outside wasn't waiting for her, it was waiting because of her. Time had stalled, the machinery of moments jammed by her defiance. She walked to the judge's bench and looked down at the empty chair. For a second, she saw herself sitting there, hands folded, expression unreadable. The image faded as quickly as it appeared. "Is this punishment?" she whispered. "Not yet." The lights flickered again. The frozen courtroom began to fade, replaced by a dozen overlapping versions of itself, the walls shifting through decades, the spectators' clothes changing styles and colors in a blur of years. She saw the same officer in a 1970s uniform, then in an 1800s coat, then in something futuristic, metallic and inhuman. Each version stared back at her with the same indifferent eyes. Althea clutched her head. "Stop." Everything went still. Her breath came ragged. She was alone again, though the silence seemed to hum with suppressed motion. She felt the weight of what she'd done, how one act of rebellion had torn through layers of time like a knife through silk. She'd wanted justice. Instead, she'd broken the rhythm that made justice possible. For a long time, she stood there, listening to the sound of nothing. Then, softly, she said, "If I started it, I can fix it." The gavel on the bench twitched. It rolled once, then stopped upright, perfectly balanced. Althea stared at it, the faintest smile crossing her lips. "All right," she said quietly. "Let's have a retrial." And as she reached for the gavel, the world exhaled, the lights dimmed, and the next second hesitated, uncertain whether to continue or to begin again. The moment her fingers brushed the gavel, the air tightened around her like a fist. Not painfully, more like the world was holding its breath, waiting to see whether she deserved to touch something so heavy with consequences. The wood was warm, almost feverish, as if it had been sitting in sunlight despite the dim room. A soft vibration pulsed through it, rhythmic and strangely familiar, like a heartbeat that wasn't hers. When she lifted it, the courtroom bent. Not collapsed, not twisted, bent, as though the walls were made of something flexible that had been kept rigid only by habit. The benches stretched a little, the floor rippled, the portraits on the walls swayed like tall grass in a non-existent wind. Althea blinked, and it all snapped back with a sound like a single drop of water hitting a lake of stillness. She exhaled slowly. "Okay," she murmured. "That's new." The gavel pulsed again, answering her. She set it down carefully, like one sets down a sleeping animal that might bite if startled. The courtroom felt different now, warmer, closer, as if leaning in. Even the dust seemed to orbit her instead of drifting freely. Althea walked toward the middle of the room. Her steps echoed twice. Once normally, and once a heartbeat later, ghost-like. She turned to see her own shadow lagging behind, a half-second late, like it was trying to remember the choreography. A nervous chuckle slipped out of her. "Great. Even my shadow's having a breakdown." The shadow didn't respond. It merely caught up, reluctantly. As she moved, the ceiling lights dimmed in a slow ripple. She felt watched, not by eyes, but by awareness itself. The room had the attentive silence of someone holding a question on their tongue. Althea approached the defense table again. It hummed faintly under her palm, as before, but now the vibration traveled up her arm and settled just behind her eyes. She shut them instinctively, and in that darkness something stirred. A corridor appeared, not the real one, but a thought-made tunnel, lined with clocks that had no hands. Each clock face turned toward her like a moon. Behind them, shadows shifted, something tall pacing slowly as if deciding whether to reveal itself. She opened her eyes sharply. The courtroom returned, but the sensation lingered. Something had looked back at her from that corridor. Something patient. "Hello," she called, voice softer than she meant. She hated how small it sounded. She'd stood up to a man with a badge and a raised hand. How was she now intimidated by a room? The answer came as a flicker. The officer reappeared for less than a second, transparent, like an afterimage burned into the air. Then another version of him, older. Then younger. Then one who wasn't an officer at all but wore a soldier's uniform from a century past. All of them flickering in and out, all versions of the same cruelty packaged differently through time. Her stomach knotted. Is this punishment? Education? A really messed up screensaver? One version of the officer, the one in the old military uniform, tilted his head slightly, as though amused. Althea took a shaky breath. Yeah, okay. Laugh it up. The flicker disappeared. Silence returned, but not the empty kind. This silence was crowded, full of motion she couldn't see, thoughts she couldn't hear, the rustle of something drawing closer in a dimension she didn't have words for. The portraits on the wall shifted again. One picture, a judge from decades past, had changed. His blurred features had sharpened slightly, revealing eyes that were definitely watching her now. She stepped closer. His pupils followed her, not with malice, but with curiosity. "Don't you start," she muttered. His mouth twitched. She stepped back quickly. The bench behind her creaked in sympathy or warning, she couldn't tell which. Althea pressed her palms to her temples. Her thoughts felt stretched thin, like someone was tweaking them at the edges, pulling apart the seams. Memories of the courtroom mixed with flashes she'd never lived. A woman in the 1800s screaming for justice, a child in a future courtroom being sentenced by a machine, an empty judge's bench glowing with white-hot authority in a world that had forgotten humans entirely. She staggered. "Stop," she whispered. Everything did. Her breath froze in her chest. Her heartbeat slowed to a thick, syrupy drag. Even her thoughts became sluggish, like they were moving through mud. And then something stepped close. Not physically, she would have seen or heard it. This thing traveled differently, arriving like a pressure behind her ribs, a presence expanding inside her skull until her own consciousness felt like a dim candle beside a massive, patient flame. A voice formed within her, not spoken, not heard, but felt. "You are not breaking. You are noticing." "Noticing what?" she whispered, afraid of the answer. "The machinery beneath your moments. The threads that believe themselves alive." The room pulsed faintly, as though agreeing. Althea shook her head. "Why me?" The presence paused, considering her question with unnerving gentleness. "Because you were seen. And therefore, you must see in return." The benches creaked again, louder this time. The portraits cleared their faces one by one. Her shadow lagged again, but this time it didn't catch up. It stayed in the far corner of the room, staring at her with a shape that no longer resembled her own. Althea's throat tightened. Oh, hell no. The presence inside her flickered with what might have been amusement. "Then walk. And learn where your steps lead when time itself watches." The air in the courtroom grew thick enough to taste. It clung to her tongue like dust and salt, the flavor of something long buried. The lights above her hummed unevenly, flickering in slow, deliberate intervals, like an old heartbeat refusing to stop. Althea's shadow remained in the corner. It stood separate now, no longer shaped by her body but by some independent geometry. Every time she blinked, its outline shifted, sometimes taller, sometimes thinner, sometimes with shoulders hunched as if under invisible weight. It was no longer her echo. It was her witness. She turned from it, refusing to acknowledge what her nerves already screamed. Her feet made no sound on the floor anymore. She felt herself moving but heard only the steady pulse of the gavel, still resting on the bench as though marking time for a song no one remembered. Noticing, she murmured to herself, echoing the voice that had spoken through her before. "I'm noticing." The word seemed to wake the air again. A low vibration ran through the wood and the walls, a resonant hum that wasn't sound so much as pressure, like a thought too large for her skull. The benches began to blur, stretching outward, revealing faint glimmers of other rooms layered beneath this one, a church, a classroom, a slave auction, a futuristic tribunal made of glass and algorithmic judgment. Each scene flickered for a heartbeat before vanishing, leaving behind the aftertaste of sorrow. Her breath came shallow and fast. "This isn't justice," she whispered. "It's rehearsal." The whisper in her mind responded, not the cold one from before, but softer, almost human. It was never justice. Only memory pretending to be fairness. The voice made her shiver. It sounded like her grandmother, but slowed down and hollowed, the way voices sound underwater. She could almost see the old woman's face in her mind, the deep lines, the quiet strength, the way she'd say, "Baby, sometimes you gotta live your life like the world's tilted and you're the only one standing straight." "Grandma," she said softly. "Names dissolve in here." Her throat tightened. "What is this place?" The silence that followed was not refusal, it was thought. And then, the place between what happens and what should have happened. The gavel pulsed once more on the bench, sending a faint tremor through the room. Althea reached toward it again, and as her fingers brushed the surface, her vision fractured. She was in the courtroom, but also standing in her mother's kitchen, age 16, holding a report card she couldn't show. Her mother's voice filled the air, calm, weary, the tone of someone who loves fiercely but has run out of gentle ways to show it. "You think the world's gonna forgive your anger just because it's right," she'd said then. The scene cracked and vanished. Now she was back in the courtroom, though it was darker, emptier. The walls dripped with faint light, as if reality itself were melting. Althea stumbled backward, her chest aching with the residue of a memory she hadn't revisited in years. "You see now?" The voice murmured. "Time does not move forward. It folds toward its own regret." "Then what am I?" The gavel answered first. A deep tone, like the first note of a sermon, echoed through the space. The portraits rattled against the walls, and her shadow in the corner finally moved, slowly, deliberately. It walked toward her, each step leaving a smear of darkness behind. "You're not me," she said. It tilted its head, mirroring her gesture with uncanny precision. "You're what I did," she whispered. "You're what I couldn't fix." Her reflection shimmered faintly on the polished floor, two Altheas, one pale with fear, one calm and composed. The calm one spoke first. "You wanted control," the reflection said, voice steady. "You wanted to rewrite it all, but you never asked what control costs." Althea stepped closer. "And what does it cost?" The reflection smiled faintly. "Continuity." The gavel struck again without her touching it. The impact rolled through the air like thunder muffled by velvet. The reflection vanished, and in its place appeared the keeper, the tall, black-suited figure she had seen before, edges of his form rippling like heat haze. His face was blank, featureless, but somehow expressive in its emptiness. He studied her for a long moment. "You're wearing it poorly," he said, voice smooth as oil. Wearing what? The mantle of interference. The illusion that power can coexist with mercy. He stepped forward, each motion oddly elegant, like a marionette pretending to be human. You reached into the gears of time and demanded justice, but gears do not feel, Althea. They grind. They turn. They consume the ones who touch them. Her jaw clenched. I just wanted to stop being powerless. And so you became the mechanism itself. She wanted to argue, but the words caught in her throat. Because some part of her knew he was right. Every correction she made, every second she rewound, had carried a little less of herself and a little more of something else. Something vast, patient, and hungry. The keeper extended a hand. Between his fingers, strands of time flickered like silk threads, moments she recognized, the officer's raised hand, her laughter outside, her mother's sigh, her grandmother's prayer whispered before dawn. Return them, he said quietly. Or they will return you. Althea looked at the strands, beautiful, trembling, alive. The idea of letting them go filled her with terror. They were all she had left of herself. Behind the keeper, the courtroom began to peel away, layer by layer, revealing the vast architecture of time itself, infinite corridors filled with mirrors, each one reflecting a different version of her life. Lives where she fought back sooner, stayed silent longer, died younger, ruled longer. The sight was unbearable. Maybe I don't want to return them, she whispered. Maybe I want to finish what I started. The keeper tilted his head. For the first time, she saw a flicker of amusement, almost admiration. Then, Althea, he said, stepping aside, you must first learn what time takes in exchange for obedience. The gavel struck once more, this time not from the bench but from somewhere within her chest, and everything went black, except for the sound of ticking, slow and infinite, counting down to something she could not yet name. The darkness lifted slowly, not as light, but as an awareness that the world around her had changed. The courtroom no longer resembled itself. The walls were taller, stretching into a void that smelled faintly of ozone and iron, and the benches curled upward like broken ribs. Every shadow moved independently, flickering and breathing, and the portraits on the walls were no longer images, they were windows into lives she had touched, twisted, or undone. Althea's chest ached. Her fingers brushed the gavel, and it felt impossibly heavy, not with wood or metal, but with consequence. She raised it, and for a moment the void hummed in sympathy, a low vibration that pulsed through her bones. The more she held it, the more the echoes of her choices pressed against her consciousness. Each flicker in the shadows was a whisper, a memory of pain she had inflicted even in the name of justice. You can't fix it, a voice said, smooth and quiet. The keeper appeared again, emerging from one of the floating shadows. Not completely. Not without paying. Althea wanted to argue. She wanted to shout that she had done nothing wrong, that she was only correcting what had been unjust. But the voices pressed in, fragments of faces, whispers of laughter, cries of anger and fear, all blending together into a single, heavy truth. Every alteration left a wound, somewhere she could not see. Her hands trembled on the gavel. She could feel every second she had rewritten like thin ice underfoot. One misstep, and the fracture would grow. Then, what do I do? She asked, almost too quietly to hear. You decide, the keeper said. But decisions are not absolution. They are exposure. The shadows twisted, forming figures she recognized, the officer who had struck her, her mother, a child she had passed in a street she no longer remembered, herself in countless versions. They watched her with impossible patience, as though daring her to choose which lives mattered, which ones she could risk, which ones she could sacrifice to the flow of time. Althea's mind flared with anger, but it was tinged with guilt. She had wanted justice, had wanted to reclaim her dignity, but at what cost? She realized that the world she thought she controlled was only a mirror of her own fear, her own desire for recognition, for balance that could never exist. Her shadow shifted, separating fully now, stepping into the void with a life of its own. "Are you always going to follow me?" she whispered, though she knew the shadow had no obligation to answer. "I follow because you notice," it seemed to reply. "And because you will not stop noticing, even when it hurts." Althea swallowed hard. She felt the gavel grow heavier in her hands, the pressure not on her fingers but in her chest, pressing against her lungs. The void around her quivered, a soft resonance of all the moments she had stolen or rewound. And beneath it all, a faint rhythm, patient and unyielding, ticked like a clock with no face. She looked toward the wall of portraits. Faces morphed and shifted, sometimes familiar, sometimes alien. One face pulled at her, hers, but older, lined with sorrow she had not yet earned. The older self's eyes bored into her soul, asking the question she had not yet dared: will you undo everything or accept what is left? Her voice broke when she answered. I don't know if I can control it anymore." "Control was never yours," the keeper said softly. "You only chose how to look at it." Althea's hands shook violently on the gavel. She could feel the weight of lives suspended between seconds, dangling by her attention. She could reach out and correct, or she could step back and let time pulse forward uncontrolled. Each choice would leave scars, not in the world, but in herself. She tried to imagine letting go, and the void reacted violently. The shadows twisted, the benches shuddered, and the portraits twisted into faces of accusation. Every figure she had tried to protect, every moment she had tried to rewrite, stared at her in reproach. She realized that mercy and cruelty were intertwined here, indistinguishable, impossible to separate. Althea sank to the floor. The gavel thudded beside her, vibrating with unspoken demand. She pressed her forehead to the polished wood and closed her eyes. Memories she had suppressed rose to the surface, the long nights her mother spent crying quietly so Althea wouldn't hear, the voices of ancestors whispering caution and defiance, the laughter she had stolen from herself in moments of fear. "Do you want to be a savior or a witness?" the keeper asked, voice quiet, almost gentle. She trembled at the question. To save, she would need to act, but every act would leave a wound. To witness, she would endure, but perhaps survive. She realized she had never wanted mere survival. She had wanted proof that dignity could bend reality without breaking it. And now she saw that proof demanded a price she had not anticipated, the weight of consequence laid bare. Althea's shadow moved closer, merging with her, pressing against her shoulders as if to share the burden. She looked into the empty eyes of the portraits and whispered, "I'll try. I'll try, even if it kills me." The void around her shivered. Time, patient and eternal, seemed to lean closer. And in the hush of all that possibility, she understood, she could no longer run. She could only decide, and every decision would carve her humanity like a knife in slow motion. The courtroom had dissolved entirely. What remained was a landscape of suspended geometry, walls bending into impossibly long corridors, benches curling into spirals that seemed to descend infinitely, and the ceiling stretching upward into a darkness mottled with distant, blinking stars. The air vibrated with the memory of voices that had never been spoken aloud, syllables that felt both intimate and cosmic, brushing against her mind like silk and steel at once. Althea stumbled forward. Her feet sank slightly into the floor, which was no longer wood but something translucent, flowing beneath her like water thickened with light. Each step left a ripple, and in the ripples, she could see reflections, not of herself, but of all the moments she had altered, frozen in infinite loops, each tiny error blooming outward like a constellation of fractures. The shadows had grown independent. They moved ahead of her, trailing threads of darkness that twined around the pillars, crawling up the walls, forming shapes that resembled faces, animals, impossible geometry. One shadow reached toward her shoulder. Not threatening, not friendly, just touching her, leaving a sensation like static under her skin. She flinched, yet felt warmth bloom at the point of contact. The keeper emerged again, stepping lightly across the distorted floor, his form flickering with hints of something not entirely human. His face remained featureless, but his presence pressed against her perception, bending not only sight but thought. "It is not enough to move moments," he said, voice echoing in her skull. "You must move possibility." Althea's eyes widened. The world shimmered. The ceiling rippled like heat over pavement. Light from unseen sources fractured, bending around the curvature of the air itself. Colors she had no names for spilled across the space, deep purples that hummed, golds that tasted of dust and flame, reds that whispered secrets she could almost understand but never fully did. She raised a hand, and the air thickened around her fingers, forming filaments of light and shadow that twined together like living ribbons. Each filament hummed with life, or memory, or both, wrapping around her palm and climbing her arm, threading through her veins. The sensation was exquisite and terrifying, a blend of pleasure and vertigo. The portraits flickered. Their faces moved now, morphing into one another, showing not just humans but hybrid forms, creatures with elongated limbs, eyes in impossible places, mouths that smiled where smiles should not exist. And yet, Althea recognized the expressions. Anger, fear, sorrow, hope, they were fragments of herself, of her ancestors, of everyone who had touched the system of judgment she had sought to undo. A laugh bubbled up from her throat, sudden and sharp. It felt alien, but it was undeniably hers. It echoed through the void, bending the shadows into spirals that danced to the rhythm of her breath. And in response, the gavel lifted from the floor, hovering before her. It was no longer wood, it had become liquid light, pouring over itself, reflecting every possible timeline at once. Althea reached out and touched it. The moment she did, the landscape shivered. The floor stretched into infinite planes, the walls dissolved into currents of memory, the shadows coalesced into a single, towering shape that seemed to breathe with the weight of all time. She looked up and saw the stars above, constellations that mirrored her heartbeat, pulsating in perfect sync with her fear, her determination, her wonder. The keeper's voice came again, calm and terrible. "You are no longer merely moving moments. You are the scene where choice and inevitability meet." Althea felt it then, the vertiginous truth, her mind stretched across timelines, her body tethered only by sensation and will. She could reach backward, forward, sideways, threads of causality bending to her attention. And yet, each movement left a scar on her soul, a faint ache that whispered of loss, of things she could never unsee. She lifted her gaze and saw herself reflected in the ripples of reality, a multitude of Altheas, each one acting in different sequences, some triumphant, some broken, some laughing at absurdity, some weeping in sorrow. And yet, all were hers. All were necessary. The shadows parted to reveal a corridor that should not exist, an infinite stair rising and twisting into nowhere. The gavel pulsed in her hand. The stars above leaned closer, curving around her like the ribs of a great cosmic leviathan. Althea stepped forward, and the floor responded. She moved through it, and the landscape breathed, rippling outward like a living tapestry. Time, possibility, memory, all bled together, indistinguishable. And in that fusion of beauty and horror, she felt herself break and reform, a prism of consciousness stretched across the edge of what was known and what would never be understood. Somewhere in the infinite, a whisper, "You are not alone. But you are responsible." And Althea realized she had never truly been alone, nor could she ever be. The unknown was no longer outside her, it was within her, shaping her, waiting for the choices she would make next. The corridors began to crumble beneath her feet. Not with the loud violence of stone breaking, but with the subtle, unbearable stretching of matter unraveling. The floor beneath Althea flexed like soft wax, folding under her weight in slow motion, as if reluctant to bear her presence any longer. She stumbled, catching herself on a warped bench that quivered beneath her touch, and the vibration traveled through her body, setting her teeth to chatter and her bones to ache with the resonance of countless timelines pressing down. The gavel in her hand had become impossibly heavy again, a nexus of every choice she had ever made. She could feel the pulse of every second she had altered, every injustice she had tried to correct, every quiet mercy she had withheld. Each pulse pressed against her lungs like the world itself trying to force the air from her, reminding her that nothing comes without cost. Shadows had multiplied, no longer subtle or obedient. They filled the void, swirling in thick eddies of darkness, faces materializing in their folds, faces she recognized but could not name. Her own fear stared back at her from one, her mother's sorrow from another, the officer's indifferent cruelty from a third. They whispered simultaneously, overlapping into a hum that made the walls pulse in sympathy. Her reflection fractured. She saw herself in dozens of forms, triumphant and ruined, laughing and screaming, serene and desperate. They were all her, and none of them were whole. The thought hit her like a physical blow. She had rewritten moments, yet in doing so, she had fractured herself irreparably. The reflection screamed silently, a gallery of Altheas trapped in the collapse of time she had invoked. The keeper appeared again, emerging from a fold in the shadows. His form was blurred, flickering with the strain of his own attention, as though the infinite weight of possibility pressed upon even him. "Do you see now?" he asked, voice smooth and cold. "This is the cost of perception. The world bends for those who interfere. And every bend leaves a wound. Here," he said, placing a hand over her chest, "and here," pointing to her mind, "and here," gesturing toward the trembling floor. Althea pressed her hands to her head. The memories she had tried to hold back surged forward, her mother's silent tears, her grandmother's warnings whispered in the night, the countless small injustices she had borne alone. They flooded her senses until she could barely breathe. She tried to scream, but the sound was swallowed by the thick air that pressed around her, carrying the weight of centuries of oppression and suffering she had never fully acknowledged. The walls began to dissolve. Portraits slid off their frames, merging with shadows, spilling memories onto the floor like ink. Benches melted into the floorboards, the floor folded into itself, and the ceiling stretched away, vanishing into darkness sprinkled with impossible constellations. She stumbled again, falling onto the warped floor. Every movement left her feeling stretched thin, as though her flesh, bone, and mind were being drawn across multiple dimensions at once. Her shadow detached completely, separating from her like a living entity, weaving through the collapsing room with a grace she envied. It touched the walls, the gavel, the floating remnants of time itself, and left traces of darkness behind, reminders that everything she touched bore the imprint of her interference. Althea's chest tightened. I can't fix it," she whispered. Every word vibrated through the crumbling space, echoing across timelines she had broken. She realized that the justice she sought had never been about correcting wrongs, it had been about asserting control, and control, she now understood, came at a price she could not measure. The keeper's voice whispered through the void. "Control is always borrowed, Althea. And you have spent more than you can repay." Tears slid down her cheeks, though they did not fall, they hovered, glimmering in the distorted air. She saw her reflection in them, fractured, infinite, a mosaic of fear, guilt, and desperate hope. She felt the weight of all the lives she had touched pressing down, each one a shadow imprint on her heart. And then, a distant sound, soft, slow, rhythmic, like the heartbeat of the world itself, reached her. She realized that despite the collapse, despite the fractures, the shadows, and the distortions, something endured. But it demanded sacrifice, her certainty, her innocence, her illusions of omnipotence. Althea's lips pressed together in a hard line. She rose unsteadily to her feet, the gavel quivering in her hands. Around her, the world shivered and moaned, bending toward entropy. She could feel it in her bones, every step forward would fracture her more. Every choice would carve deeper scars. Yet still, she had to move. The void exhaled. The shadows surged forward, wrapping around her, both embracing and constricting. Her mind strained under the weight of infinite possibility, her soul stretched thin across the threads of reality she had dared to touch. And in that unbearable tension, she realized the ultimate truth: to witness, to act, to survive, she would be transformed, forever broken, forever responsible, forever bound to the delicate, horrifying beauty she had unveiled. And so she stepped forward, trembling, into the collapse, the gavel in her hand, the shadows at her heels, and the endless, unknowable expanse of time itself waiting to consume or reshape her. Althea stood at the center of the void, the gavel cold in her hands despite the heat of the collapsing world. The shadows had receded, curling back into themselves, leaving only faint traces like smoke clinging to the edges of memory. The constellations above, twisted, impossible, unfamiliar, were no longer hostile. They watched her with quiet indifference, as though they had been waiting for this precise moment all along. The corridors of fractured reality had folded back into something resembling coherence. The courthouse walls shimmered faintly, their angles softened, the benches realigned. Yet nothing could truly be restored. Every choice she had made, every moment she had rewritten, remained etched into the structure of time, invisible cracks running like veins through the world. The gavel pulsed once, a heartbeat in her palm, and she understood, it did not belong to her, but it would carry the weight of her decisions indefinitely. Her shadow, finally reconciled with her own form, pressed close. It was no longer separate, no longer a witness or a ghost, it was a part of her, every fear and every triumph compressed into a living companion she could neither abandon nor escape. She felt it in her bones, the faint echo of all the lives she had altered, all the choices she had imposed. And yet, there was a strange serenity in that knowledge, as if the fractures themselves had taught her a kind of wisdom that obedience never could. The keeper appeared for the last time, standing at the edge of perception, his figure blurred, faceless, infinite. "You have learned, Althea," he said, voice low, reverberating in the spaces between her thoughts. "Not merely the weight of choice, but its inevitability. That which is changed returns in a form of its own. You are part of the machinery now, yet you are not its master." She nodded, feeling the truth of his words settle like sediment in her chest. She had sought justice, but what she had found was understanding, that the cosmos does not bend for righteousness, nor for cruelty, nor for grief. It bends only for persistence, for awareness, and for those willing to bear the consequences of noticing. Althea lowered the gavel, setting it carefully on the bench. Its pulse slowed, as though satisfied with her acceptance. In the quiet that followed, she allowed herself a long, slow breath. Memories surfaced, her mother's gentle admonishments, her grandmother's whispered prayers, the laughter of children in alleys she had once passed by without notice. Each memory carried a weight, a lesson in fragility and endurance. She understood now that love and care were not escapes from responsibility, they were the only way to bear it. Outside, the faintest hint of light began to bend through the impossibly high windows. It was not sunlight, nor moonlight, nor artificial glow, it was something older, impartial, infinite. The shadows of the past and the projections of the future wavered and dissolved into this light, leaving her standing alone but intact. Althea closed her eyes. She had changed. She had survived the fractures of time and the reflection of her own ambitions, and she carried the scars like a map of the infinite. The world, both the human one and the cosmic, remained indifferent, immense, beautiful, and terrifying. She was smaller than she had ever realized, yet she had touched the strands of eternity. A faint smile ghosted her lips. Perhaps she had not rewritten justice. Perhaps she had not mended the past. But she had learned to carry the weight of knowing, to walk forward under the gaze of the universe without pleading for permission or mercy. The gavel, the shadows, the fractures, they were all hers now, not as instruments of power, but as reminders of the delicate, incomprehensible lattice of existence. She stepped away from the bench, each footfall resonating softly across the still, quiet courthouse, and the universe folded around her, indifferent yet intimate, infinite yet incomprehensibly small. And in that stillness, Althea understood the final truth: to live was to endure, to love, to witness, and to move forward, no matter how vast, how indifferent, how unfathomable the cosmos might be. And somehow, against that infinite backdrop, that was enough.